We're going to listen to our scriptures now as Jean brings our reading from the second book of Kings.
The reading this morning can be found on page 367, Kings chapter 5, reading from verse 1. Naaman is cured. Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army, was highly respected and esteemed by the king of Syria, because through Naaman the Lord had given victory to the Syrian forces. He was a great soldier, but he suffered from a dreaded skin disease. In one of their raids against Israel, the Syrians carried off a little Israelite girl who became a servant to Naaman's wife. One day she said to her mistress, "I wish that my master could go to the prophet who lives in Samaria. He would cure him of his disease." When Naaman heard of this, he went to the king and told him what the girl had said. The king said, "Go to the king of Israel and take this letter with you." So Naaman set out, taking 30,000 pieces of silver, 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of fine clothes. The letter that he took read, "This letter will introduce my officer Naaman. I want you to cure him of his disease." When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes in dismay and exclaimed, "How can the king of Syria expect me to cure this man? Does he think that I am God with the power of life and death? It's plain that he's trying to start a quarrel with me." When the prophet Elisha heard what had happened, he sent word to the king. "Why are you so upset? Send the man to me, and I'll show him that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariot and stopped at the entrance to Elisha's house. Elisha sent a servant out to tell him to go and wash himself 7 times in the river Jordan, and he would be completely cured of his disease. But Naaman left in a rage, saying, "I thought he would at least come out to me, pray to the Lord his God, wave his hand over the diseased spot and cure me. Besides, aren't the rivers of Abana and Paphar back in Damascus better than any river in Israel? I could have washed in them and be cured." His servants went up to him and said, "Sir, if the prophet had told you to do something difficult, you would have done it. Now why don't you just wash yourself as he said and be cured?" So Naaman went down to the Jordan, dipped himself in it 7 times, as Elisha had instructed, and he was completely cured. His flesh became firm and healthy, like that of a child. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
In our reading from 2 Kings that we heard a short while ago, we have the story of the healing of Naaman. Naaman was the captain or the commander of the king of Aram. He was important, he was respected. He suffered from a dreaded skin disease. In many translations we find that we're told he suffered from leprosy, which is not necessarily the same disease that we associate with the name. Indeed, it's in reality unlikely to be so, but it could be any one of a number of skin complaints. But whatever, it is something that causes him to be unhappy. Imagine, or you may not need to think even, about having a disease that, or a condition that persists, that gets you down, that makes you feel distressed or depressed. Have you been there? Are you perhaps suffering like that now? I've been there. I suffer, as many of you may know, from a skin complaint. I have eczema, and I've had it for almost as long as I can remember. I think it's probably got worse as I've got older, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Memories of young days, as you know, don't always come clearly to us. But I've certainly had it for pretty much as long as I can remember. And the question comes to me sometimes, would I be classed, in what was written in the scriptures, would I be classed as a leper? Possibly so. As we touched upon last week, as we looked at the healing of the 10 and the one who came back to give thanks, that the 13th chapter of Leviticus, going back into the depths of the Old Testament, details how such a disease or an illness is to be diagnosed and then dealt with. And throughout the chapter, in most translations, it speaks of leprosy. As we said, though, that's not necessarily leprosy as we think of it. The New Bible Commentary speaks of it in this way. It says, the Hebrew word used to be translated leprosy, but it is now questioned whether the symptoms described correspond to leprosy proper, that is, Hansen's disease as we know it. It seems, actually, that it covers a range of conditions where swelling, discoloration, scaliness or flakiness are present. Certainly, if we think of it in that way, they are all symptoms that I can attest to. So, as I said, I suffer from eczema. It has been bad over different times. Most of the time, it's just a simple, shall we say, irritation. I have it manifests itself as dry skin most of the time, which is why it's so flaky, and that's what causes me to itch. If you'll see me scratching a lot probably because I itch with my dry skin. I have to put ridiculous amounts of emollient on to try and even make it stop being dry for a brief moment, and it never quite works for very long, but you know, that's just the way life is. We don't worry about such things generally, but that's my condition. It is dry skin most of the time, but at times, occasionally, it becomes different to that. It becomes what I would call bad. It gets to a point where I get even more uncomfortable with it. It was especially bad in early 2005 while I was at theological college. I got to a point where my skin was dreadful. I don't know what started it up, but I got to it being dreadfully itchy, awfully itchy, and I would scratch, and I know I mustn't scratch. You might have heard of that itch-scratch cycle. I know that I mustn't scratch because it makes it worse, but at the same time, oh, it's such a relief to scratch. It's one of those dreadful curses of life, isn't it? and I was in a situation where it was dreadfully bad. Not just I scratch and it might make it a little bit more red or whatever, but actually my eczema was really making me feel bad in all sorts of ways. I don't think before that point I realised quite how much bearing your skin can have on your general condition of life and how you feel. With your skin being such a large organ of the body, and covering so much of you, obviously, actually when it goes wrong, it is quite debilitating. And I went through a period of 6 to 8 weeks where I was in a dreadful point, to the point that my scratching was damaging my skin. And I would scratch, and there's a point where I'm scratching, I can feel it gets to a point where actually if I scratch beyond that, I know it's not right, rather than just it's, superficial. And I can remember being at points of scratching and think, I must stop, but I can't. And being in tears over it. Being in a situation where I felt dreadful because I was doing it, but not being able to stop myself. And then because my skin was terrible, not being able to sleep at night. And as you know, sleep is the greatest healer. And so because I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't having that natural healing and reconditioning of the skin. And so it went round that the next day I was feeling dreadful and worse. And it went on in an ever deepening spiral, going down and down and down. And it's the one time in my life where I've had what I would describe, and forgive me for those who have ever suffered it in a proper bad way, that I would describe as a bit of depression. It was only very brief. It only lasted a short while, but I felt dreadful about everything. I found it difficult to do anything. Because physically I felt awful, but mentally and emotionally and spiritually I felt awful as well. Thankfully it didn't last long. God was good to me and I was blessed, but it was not a good time. When you suffer in such a way, you can become desperate. you will, you wish, you hope for any cure. Yet such a cure is not always found. I can remember, one of the things I can remember as being a youngster, maybe not a child, but a teenager and old, I can remember that I've prayed that I might wake up one day and my skin might have come off like some sort of insect that's growing and sheds its exoskeleton for a bit. That might happen to me, that my skin might somehow amazingly all come off in one nice big shell and I'd be able to step away from it and my skin underneath would be different and I wouldn't have the suffering that I've had with it and the irritation. As a side issue, if you see me scratching for prolonged times, you have Lynn's permission. I don't know whether you have mine, but you have Lynn's permission to tell me off and to give me a little slap or something. 10 scratches is the limit she gives me. And then I get tutted at or spoken to or whatever. And she would very much encourage you to, if you ever see me going beyond that, to tell me off. And I know she does it for my best interest. You know, I'm being flippant about it here, but it's because, you know, she cares and doesn't want me to suffer in that way. It does make it worse. And if I'm ever bad about it, it's often because stress affects me. That's how stress manifests itself in my body. It works for us all in different ways. Stress comes out in my skin for some reason. I don't know why, but that's how it does. And in odd ways that we can't understand. Before we got married, I had a very brief bout of sciatica, which if you've not had it, you don't want it. It's one of those things that people always talk about, oh, sciatica is a dreadful pain, and I always thought, yeah, it can't be that. It is. But when I was in the depths of that pain, excruciating pain, Lynn will comment about the fact that actually I started scratching. Couldn't do anything else, but I started scratching. Didn't even realise I was doing it, and very, very vigorously. Anyway, I'm going off the track here, sorry. You desire, to go back, you desire when you're suffering for a cure to be found. We often desire the miraculous, as I spoke about, wanting my skin to disappear in the way that it is. We often desire the miraculous, instant type of intervention and healing that we see in many places in the gospel. We'd love that to happen. That somehow God would come alongside us and be able to go like that, and that would be done with. But it isn't always the way it works, is it? Sadly. But let's look at this story of Naaman and how the healing works for him and how he reacts to what's going on. While we're in that story early on, there is an Israelite girl, a captive, a servant, who is there within the household. Actually, she's the servant of Naaman's wife. And she sees Naaman's distress, and she speaks of Elisha, this prophet back from her homeland. She is bold in doing so. Can you imagine her being in that situation as a servant of that family, actually of Naaman's wife, and coming out and saying, look, I can see Naaman's in trouble. I think he needs to go and see Elisha. Naaman goes to his king following that, though. He reports to the king what the servant girl has said, and so Naaman is sent then by his king to the king of Israel, the letter and with gifts. That letter causes great misunderstanding, and it appears to ignore that key information that the servant girl gave about Elisha, because the letter says, I've sent Naaman to you, king of Israel, that you may cure him of his leprosy. And the king of Israel takes this approach, this question, this request as an insult. I do find it odd that throughout this passage, that as I say, in many translations it talks of leprosy, that there's never any comment within this about how the leprosy could make others unclean. That when in Jewish tradition and what the scriptures say, if you come in contact with something else or someone else that's unclean, you become unclean. And so that may not be an important thing back where Naaman comes from, but certainly when he comes to Israel to meet the king, you would think that would be an important thing, but it doesn't ever get mentioned at all. I think it was a risky thing to go there, being classed as a leper. But the king believes with this letter, believes the approach to be a deliberate attempt to cause trouble between the two nations. He asks, am I God? Interestingly, there's some recognition there that who it is who actually has the power to heal in amongst all this upset. And he rends or he tears his garments in horror because of what's going on. How dare you come to me with this letter? It's awful. It's going to start a war. What are you coming to me for? And rips his clothes. An act that is, as one commentator puts it, a pitiful Oscar performance of overacting. You can just picture it, can't you? Read that. This king just going ludicrously mad about what's going on. It's at this point that Elisha steps in. He speaks reason to the king of Israel. He suggests that the king send Naaman to him. And so Naaman thus arrives at Elisha's house, where Elisha instructs him through the intermediary of a messenger. Not the thing to do, it seems, according to Naaman, because that angers Naaman. There's a lot of anger in this story. 14 verses, and yet we see anger again and again. It angers Naaman because he's not treated as he expects to be, not treated as he's used to being treated as the important person he is, not treated how he thinks he should be treated. He takes umbrage. He takes it as an insult. Why should he bathe in the Jordan? Aren't the rivers back home where I was there, aren't they adequate? In fact, aren't they better than this horrible little river? Did I really come this far just for this? How ridiculous is all this? And then his servants call upon him to reconsider. They too are bold. There's boldness in this story. Here, as with the servant girl, we have lowly people daring to speak out before those who have all authority over them. They risk all to bring comfort. They possibly break protocol to do so. The servant girl acknowledges noticing things where perhaps she's not supposed to see. Although we don't know exactly what the relationship would have been between servant and slave and master there. I mean, I'm putting perhaps a slightly Victorian spin on things like that, where the servants weren't supposed to see anything, but maybe it was like that. It seems sensible to think that maybe servants weren't meant to comment on things like that. And after all, Naaman wasn't her direct master. She worked for his wife. And these other servants in front of Elisha's house dare to challenge Naaman in his angry outburst, in the midst of his anger. What a time to come to someone and say, hang on a minute, do you not think you're just going a little bit silly here? They dare to challenge him in his angry outburst, and they coerce him into complying with Elisha's command. Why refuse to do something, they say to him? What wisdom these people have. Why refuse to do something just because it's easier than you expected? Are we like this? We often want God to work in miraculous ways. But that miracle often has to be for us sudden, dramatic, instantly life-changing. We might even expect to have to do something challenging in order to receive a blessing, rather like Naaman did. He thought he should be doing something, I'm Naaman, I'm this great commander, I'll go and do this and then that will make me better, rather than just receive the blessing. We don't often look for God to work quietly and gently. We often forget to accept that God, that God acts in grace. And we can become upset when God works through other means. We can become upset when God doesn't speak to us directly. And when we do, when this happens to us, when we get upset about such things, when we go into that overacting Oscar effort, we can have a tendency to ignore the opportunity that God is offering to us. It reminds me of that story, that joke, whatever you might want to call it, however you want to class it. I hesitate to call it a joke because people think different things are jokes, of course. But that story of the man in the flood, you may well have heard it. The man who's in the flood and prays to be saved. And as the floodwaters rise, he climbs higher and higher in his house, even up to the roof. And as the story goes along, first of all, a fire engine comes along while it still can along the road. And they say, well, come with us, we'll save you. He said, no, I'm praying to God. God's going to save me. And then later on, a boat comes along in the rising waters and says, come and get into the boat with us. No, God is going to save me. I've prayed to him. And so as he's on his roof with the waters around him and clinging on, a helicopter comes along. Come with us, we're going to save you. Get on. Come. No, I'm praying to God. He's going to save me. Refuses each of these offers. Consequently, over time, he drowns. And in heaven, as he comes to God, he asks him, why didn't you answer my prayer? And God's reply is, I sent a fire engine, I sent a boat, I sent a helicopter, What more did you want? Are we like this? Do we miss the opportunities and offers that God places before us? Be willing to look for God in the ordinary. Yes, he can, and he might work through the shocking and the dramatic, but more often than not, he works in the normal and the everyday. God's answers are not always the answers we desire. But as Paul found out, God says, my grace is sufficient for you. And though those answers may not always be what we desire, we shouldn't allow that to cause us to fail to see when he does answer us. Don't miss God speaking or acting just because he does so in ways that you're not looking for. Don't miss God speaking or acting just because he does so in ways that you are not looking for. Watch for him, listen for him, and respond when he calls. May we all be willing to respond to our God, whether he comes to us in dramatic ways or quietly when perhaps we're not expecting it. But may we listen and watch and respond when he does come. Amen.